Wait, did desperation unlock a terrifying new kind of worship? Standing at the edge of the square, the air thick with wood smoke and unwashed desperation, across the medieval world, the Black Death, the great purifier, the great equalizer, had consumed families in days, leaving an echoing silence in its wake. Famine stalked the emptied storage rooms, and faith, once a solace, now curdled into frantic terror. It was in this crucible of despair that a profound, terrifying new idea took root, the belief that the pain inflicted upon one's own flesh could somehow appease a vengeful God. As they searched for a spiritual lightning rod, a sacrificial act powerful enough to shield their community from the catastrophe that had swallowed half the known world. And what came next changed everything about how humanity experienced suffering. Discover the shocking sound that ripped through the medieval streets and learn how a collective trauma became a public prayer written in fresh blood. The sound starts small, a low, rhythmic thudding, rapidly growing into a collective, percussive trauma as groups of men emerge from the shadows of the cathedral, stripped bare from the waist up. In their hands they carry the instruments of their devotion, heavy whips made not just of leather, but fitted with metal, wood, and barbs designed to tear, not merely sting. Their backs already bore the mottled hieroglyphs of previous suffering, but they raised the weapons again. As the first strike descends, the crowd holds its breath, watching the crimson bloom instantly upon pale skin. This wasn't merely penance. It was a desperate public prayer written in fresh blood, revealing how the fear of plague transformed into radical self-punishment. Poisonous, you need to see the terrifying reason why people fell to their knees during these parades. Watch the faces in the assembly as some fall to their knees, convinced they are witnessing a holy spectacle, the visible manifestation of suffering required for salvation, while others gaze away, their eyes fixed on the ground, yet they dare not leave. To depart was to announce oneself as faithless, indifferent to the spiritual survival of the community, and as fear intensified, these processions swelled into a massive movement. Entire villages joined, driven by the chilling conviction that this ritual was their sole defense against the unseen enemy that had already silenced their neighbors. Reason surrendered, and pain became the new liturgy, demonstrating the true power of psychological contagion during the plague years. How did a search for spiritual truth become a mandate for forced conformity? The original script, the blueprint for this self-inflicted ritual, quickly became corrupted. The whipping continued until individuals faltered, their strength giving way. Yet they were not offered rest. They were lifted, pushed, and coerced to continue striking themselves, the collective belief system demanding continuous endurance. What began as a genuine, desperate search for absolution gradually morphed into something darker, a public spectacle, a tool of forced conformity, and the flagellant's instrument of penance stopped being merely a spiritual aid and became, instead, a terrifying cultural mandate, showing the medieval world's most brutal form of peer pressure. The terrible genius of medieval torture is hidden in this device. The physical composition of the whip itself reflects this era's understanding of severe suffering. This was no simple strap, but an apparatus engineered for maximum survivable injury. Medieval philosophy often prioritized pain that lasted, leaving a visible, permanent testament to the offense or the devotion. A typical instrument featured multiple tails, often hardened and waxed leather, capable of shattering the skin's surface on impact. But this wasn't the end of how they engineered pain.
You won't believe what they embedded in the leather to guarantee tearing. The truly damaging elements were the additions woven directly into the cords, pieces of iron, small metal hooks, or fragments of sharpened bone. These inclusions ensured that every swing resulted not in a bruise, but in a deliberate tear of the flesh. The architect of this suffering did not intend to knock the victim unconscious. The purpose was to guarantee that every contact left an indelible, historical scar. Knots were often placed along the cords to create swollen welts that would inevitably burst open under subsequent impacts, revealing the deliberate design for long-term, distributed agony. Discover the paradox of the flagellant's whip, pain designed to break you without ending your life. A few minutes of this rhythmic violence could transform an unbroken back into a raw landscape of open wounds and exposed tissue. Crucially,
The design served a paradoxical function. It avoided causing death. Unlike the sharp blade of a traditional executioner's weapon, the flagellant's whip was calibrated to deliver profound, intense, yet distributed suffering, damage designed for the body to survive. This made it the preferred instrument when the goal was to break an individual, mentally and physically, without ending their life entirely, illustrating the medieval focus on chronic, visible suffering. Learn how this painful object became a symbol of public humiliation. Its universal effectiveness meant the whip functioned identically, whether wielded in fervent self-punishment or deployed by an external authority enforcing discipline. Simple to construct, requiring only cheap materials yet devastating in its efficacy, it rapidly became a common instrument of public discipline. By the time the fervor reached its peak, the whip was understood less as a symbol of spiritual dedication and more as a recognized mark of communal humiliation.
Its presence alone announced the spectacle of suffering before a single cord made contact with the skin, demonstrating how cheap tools can yield devastating social control. How did ordinary people turn physical anguish into their only defense against the apocalypse? Public self-flagellation became the dominant, recurring visual motif of the medieval crisis years. These movements did not originate from the mandates of kings with a structure of standing armies. They sprung organically from the deepest despair of ordinary people, those convinced the final days were upon them. Their defense against pestilence, against the unknown void, and against perceived divine wrath lay solely in voluntary physical anguish, revealing the profound spiritual desperation that drove the flagellant movement. Imagine the eerie sound of prayers mingling with the wet thwack of the descending chords. Visualize the scene. Massive assemblies gathering in open plazas, churchyards, and public commons. They moved through the narrow streets in a slow, almost hypnotic line, chanting prayers that mingled with the wet thwack of the descending chords. Their ranks were often bolstered by travelers from neighboring towns, demonstrating the rapid contagion of this dark belief. The communal gathering was thought to possess a palpable, protective spiritual power, showing how collective suffering became a viral phenomenon. The tools of devotion suffering was undeniable. The instruments of their devotion were largely homemade, crude whips fashioned from whatever materials lay at hand, rope, leather scraps, metal filings, or salvaged bone fragments. Though lacking professional uniformity, their capacity for causing severe suffering was undeniable. The participants struck their own shoulders and backs in a regulated cadence, the leather tails digging in, the metal attachments tearing small breaches in the skin that steadily widened, detailing the terrifying simplicity of their self-made instruments. Why did stopping mean risking the entire community's mercy? As the ritual progressed, minutes turned into an agonizing quarter hour. The skin became raw, and subsequent lashes landed not on intact flesh, but directly upon exposed, tender tissue. Yet they continued. To hesitate or stop was to display a profound weakness, a lack of faith that could jeopardize the entire community's appeal for mercy. These processions often lasted hours, covering immense distances, a grim parade of determined, suffering bodies, revealing the immense social pressure fueling endurance. Find out how witnessing this horrific pain made the ritual undeniable spiritual truth. The spectacle had a profound and dangerous psychological impact on the witnesses. Observing people willingly embrace such horrific pain convinced many that the ritual held undeniable spiritual meaning, a hidden, necessary truth. Some joined the ranks instantly. Others followed in silent dread, terrified of being perceived as indifferent to the looming catastrophe. But even as the lay community embraced it, certain church officials began to feel the cold certainty of losing control, demonstrating the psychological mechanism that drove mass adoption of pain became a terrifying form. Flagellant movement was too large, too decentralized, and too zealous to be managed by traditional ecclesiastical structures. As time passed, the ritual began to fundamentally shift social metrics. Devotion became quantifiable, measured precisely by the individual's capacity to endure pain. Those who struck with greater force earned respect. Those who showed reluctance became objects of sharp suspicion. Pain had become a form of public, spiritual competition, showcasing how extreme suffering was weaponized for social status. How did religious self-lashing pave the way for state-enforced punishment? This normalization of intense, self-inflicted suffering had a chilling influence on local governing authorities. Once the public accepted severe lashing as a necessary religious act, it became vastly easier for secular leaders to adopt it as a state punishment. If citizens accepted the whip voluntarily to cleanse their souls, then lashes enforced by law seemed not only justified, but perhaps even doubly purifying. The line between sacred suffering and enforced public suffering began to dissolve, establishing a horrifying new legal precedent. This blurring of sacred and secular pain changed the justice system forever. This blurring of boundaries established the perfect stage for the whip's widespread adoption in medieval courts and systems of public discipline. Meanwhile, within the cloistered walls of the monasteries, the whip was integrated into a controlled, highly structured system of penance. Monks lived under a rigid code of silence, prayer, and obedience. Any perceived transgression, whether minute or serious, could mandate disciplinary whipping, highlighting the institutionalization of the instrument. Why did monks believe physical pain was the ultimate hardening agent for the spirit? The monastic rationale was simple. Physical pain was seen as a hardening agent for the spirit, effectively burning away sinful impulses and strengthening spiritual focus. Punishments were meticulously structured, decided upon by the senior monks or abbots, who determined the exact number of lashes and the precise setting. Offenses could range dramatically, from speaking without specific permission to the far graver sin of showing unwarranted pride, detailing the system of controlled suffering. Learn why showing pride could trigger a punitive lashing. Because humility was the cardinal virtue of the cloister, even minor indications of self-importance could trigger a punitive sentence. Monks generally accepted these sentences with quiet resignation.
For resistance would signify a challenge to the entire spiritual architecture of the order. The specific instruments used in the monastery varied, some being simple cords, others featuring deeply bruising knots, and the most severe carrying the metal additions seen in the public rituals, illustrating the range of monastic discipline tools. Some monks embraced brutal self-whipping away from the public eye. The intensity of the monastic discipline was dictated by the order's specific traditions and the abbot's philosophical view on correction. Some orders believed that truly harsh whipping was essential for focusing the mind, while others favored a less severe approach. Self-whipping remained common, a private act performed quietly in personal chambers or during the deep silence of the night hours, intended solely to purify the mind through repeated suffering, away from the public gaze, showing the private extremes of devotion. Extreme suffering was seen by some leaders as the ultimate, indisputable sign of holiness. Some monks, driven by a profound and sometimes destructive pursuit of spiritual perfection, were documented by contemporaries as whipping themselves until they collapsed from sheer exhaustion or sustained long-term injury. These extreme beliefs were often reinforced by powerful leaders who interpreted such intense suffering as the ultimate, indisputable sign of holiness. This monastic severity, too, influenced the wider secular world, demonstrating how spiritual zeal fueled dangerous physical destruction. How did the monks inadvertently legitimize the whip for secular punishment? Many surrounding towns looked to the monasteries as the very embodiment of moral authority. Witnessing respected monks regularly employ the whip as an acceptable means of correction inadvertently conferred an air of nobility onto the instrument. This further strengthened its acceptance and prevalence in local courts, familial settings, and community discipline systems,
revealing the unintended consequences of monastic rigor. Why did medieval courts need punishments that were instantaneous and unforgettable? As fear-driven rituals gained deep societal penetration, the state apparatus recognized the whip's immense utility as a practical tool of enforcement. Medieval courts rarely possessed structured prisons, professional long-term detention facilities, or organized guard systems. Punishments needed to be instantaneous, cost-effective, and unforgettable. The flagellant whip fulfilled every requirement, explaining the practical reasons for the whip's dominance in medieval justice. Find out how public lashing became theatrical reinforcement of state authority. It required no complex apparatus, was easily employed in any public square, and, most critically, delivered visible, instant suffering, a potent theatrical reinforcement of central authority. Whipping swiftly became the standard response for a dauntingly wide spectrum of transgressions, including petty theft, betrayal,
dishonesty, blasphemy, and any perceived act of civil defiance, illustrating how efficiency and spectacle drove judicial brutality. The core purpose was dual: to condemn the offender and broadcast a terrifying warning. The core purpose was dual: to condemn the individual offender and simultaneously to broadcast a terrifying warning to the entire community. When correction was delivered openly, the spectators were forced to internalize the consequences of challenging the rigid social or legal order. The procedure was swift and intentionally brutal, highlighting the use of punishment as a mass deterrent. Discover the lack of due process in a medieval public whipping. The condemned individual was brought forth, identified, and the sentence was pronounced. Legal representation was often non-existent. Minimal investigation was usually performed.
The courts of the age prioritized immediate obedience and maintaining order above any consideration of due process or fairness. The person was then secured, often to a permanent post, a simple beam, or even a heavy cartwheel, and stripped of upper garments, detailing the swift, unfair process of medieval justice. Fainting was not permitted to delay or interrupt the mandated sentence. The official administering the correction, frequently a town guard or appointed official, delivered the lashes with maximum force, intended to break the skin and inflict deep, purple welts. Should the condemned collapse, they were given enough water to revive them and then lifted back up. Fainting was not permitted to delay or interrupt the mandated sentence. The focus was on delivering the exact, full number of lashes, regardless of the individual's physical collapse, showing the relentless nature of the punishment. Striped were permanent, but the worst damage was the instant loss of social standing. The aftermath often proved more perilous than the public punishment itself. The open wounds were highly susceptible to infection, hygiene being near non-existent. Many carried the physical brand of these events for their entire lives. Though legally labeled as non-lethal, the emotional and social impact was equally devastating. Being whipped in public instantly severed a person's social standing. They would be distrusted, ridiculed, and often avoided long after the scars had superficially healed, revealing the lasting social death imposed by the whipping post. From a religious sacrifice to the core instrument of state control, this is the chilling evolution of the whip. The tragic ubiquity of court-ordered whipping meant that towns began keeping these instruments perpetually ready in public view. Some officials even added specialized metal pieces to guarantee an intensifying severity of pain. The evolution of this instrument demonstrates a profound and disturbing shift in the medieval world, from a desperate religious self-punishment into the core institutionalized instrument of state authority and control. If this story made you reflect on the fragility of power, stay with us for the next chapter of Forgotten History.